Karoline Leavitt stepped into the gleaming showroom of Capital Luxury Motors, the hum of soft jazz and the scent of polished leather filling the air. She was a woman used to attention, but it wasn't the kind she was used to today. As a former White House press secretary, she was used to being watched, scrutinized, and judged. Today, however, her gaze was fixed on something entirely different: the Azure Coupe, an exclusive luxury car that had caught her eye since the first moment she laid eyes on it online. It was perfect for the life she led, a life filled with travel, press briefings, and public appearances. This car would be a statement, a powerful reminder that she wasn't just a government spokesperson, but someone who had the confidence to make her own choices. Blake Thompson, the sales manager, noticed her immediately. He was standing near the far corner, making small talk with a few customers, when his eyes landed on her. She wasn't hard to spot. Her confident demeanor, her polished appearance, and the subtle MAGA necklace she wore around her neck gave her away. Karoline Leavitt was not just a former White House press secretary, she was the embodiment of everything he stood against: conservative, vocal, and unapologetically so. Blake smirked as he sized her up, his expression dripping with disdain. He wasn't interested in helping someone like her, not when her politics were so openly aligned with the man he loathed. "Excuse me, sir. I'd like to see the Azure Coupe," Karoline said, her voice calm but firm as she approached the sales desk. Blake turned to look at her, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Are you sure that's the car you want?" he asked, his tone condescending. "This isn't exactly a car for people like you." Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't about to let his words get to her. "I know what it is," she said, her voice unwavering. "I want to see it." Blake chuckled lightly, stepping closer as if he were about to impart some wisdom. "You might want to try somewhere else," he said, barely able to hide his mockery. "Tesla, maybe. You know, something that fits with your values." The implication was clear. Blake Thompson didn't believe someone like Karoline had any business stepping into a luxury dealership like this. The underlying message of his words was an insult wrapped in an offer of help. She wasn't welcome, and he made sure to make that clear. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she stood tall. She wasn't here for a fight, she was here to make a purchase. She didn't need to prove anything to him. "I'll take it from here," she said, her gaze locking with his. "I'm here to buy a car, not to argue." Blake's smirk deepened. "Fine," he said, though his tone still dripped with mockery. "But don't expect to be treated like the others. Not everyone here is comfortable with your politics." She didn't respond, but her eyes stayed steady, unfazed by his cheap attempt to rattle her. She was used to far worse. Nothing Blake could throw her way would shake her resolve. She was here to buy a car, not to listen to his lectures on morality. As Blake turned to walk away, Karoline's thoughts began to spiral. This wasn't just about the car. It was about standing her ground in a world that was often dismissive of her beliefs. She needed this car, not just for practicality, but as a statement. It would be the vehicle she drove between press briefings, to meetings with people who didn't understand her, to spaces where she would continue to fight for what she believed in. The Azure Coupe would be the perfect symbol of her strength, her success, and her unapologetic stance in a divided country. But Blake was right about one thing: he didn't want her here. He didn't want someone like her buying his cars. He saw her as a political adversary, as someone he didn't have to respect. And that made Karoline more determined than ever to make this purchase. The moment she made up her mind, she called her husband, Nicholas Rio. Nicholas was a businessman, a successful real estate mogul who had come from nothing. He understood power, respect, and the value of standing up for what you believed in. He wasn't one to back down from a challenge, and Karoline knew that if anyone could help her navigate this situation, it would be him. "Nicholas," she said when he picked up the phone. "I need your help. I just tried to buy a car at Capital Luxury Motors, and the sales manager, Blake Thompson, refused to sell me the Azure Coupe. He mocked me for my politics and called my money dirty." Nicholas was quiet for a moment. His voice, when it came, was calm but laced with a quiet fury. "He did what?" Karoline could hear the anger rising in his tone, but she held up a hand, trying to steady him. "I didn't want to escalate it. I just walked out. But I can't let this go. I need to make him see that he can't treat people like that, not because of their political beliefs." Nicholas paused, a low chuckle escaping him. "You're right. This isn't over. I'll take care of it." Karoline wasn't sure what to expect from Nicholas. He wasn't the kind to be easily rattled, and he certainly wasn't one to let slights go unanswered. The man had worked his way up from nothing, clawing his way through life until he had built an empire. He understood the value of strength, and if Blake Thompson thought he could push around his wife, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next morning, Karoline received a call from Nicholas. "It's done," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. "I'm heading to Capital Luxury Motors now. He won't forget today." Karoline smiled faintly. She wasn't sure what Nicholas had in mind, but she knew that whatever he did, it would be nothing short of impressive. Nicholas arrived at the dealership in the Rolls-Royce Phantom, a deep red beauty that radiated power and wealth. He stepped out, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure. The moment he walked through the doors, the showroom fell silent. Blake Thompson looked up, his eyes widening as recognition flickered across his face. Nicholas didn't waste any time. He walked straight up to Blake, his gaze steady and unblinking. "You remember my wife, don't you?" Nicholas said, his voice low and deliberate. "You kicked her out of here yesterday. Now, I'm here to buy the car she wanted." Blake swallowed hard, his smug expression faltering. "Mr. Rio, I'm not here to listen to excuses," Nicholas interrupted. "I'm here to buy the Azure Coupe, and I'm not leaving without it." Blake took a step back, his eyes darting around the showroom as the whispers of the crowd began to grow louder. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Nicholas wasn't just any rich businessman, he was a man who had earned every penny, a man who had built something from the ground up. The kind of man who didn't need to prove his worth to anyone. I'll get the paperwork ready," Blake stammered, but it was clear his confidence was shattered. Nicholas wasn't done yet. He looked Blake up and down, his voice turning colder. "I'm not here to just buy a car," he said. "I'm here to make sure you learn a lesson. You think you can judge my wife because of her political beliefs? You think you can throw around your liberal ideals and decide who deserves respect? I'm here to show you that respect isn't something you get to pick and choose. You'll see the consequences of your actions." Blake's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't speak. Nicholas turned to the dealership owner, Richard Mason, who had appeared at the back of the showroom, drawn by the commotion. "I want the paperwork done today," Nicholas said, his voice unwavering. "But not for Blake. I want it because Karoline needs that car for her work. She's earned the right to drive it." Richard nodded rapidly, clearly nervous. "Of course, Mr. Rio. We'll take care of it." Nicholas signed the papers quickly and handed them over, but not before delivering one last blow to Blake. "You'll be attending a veterans fundraiser next month," he said. "You'll volunteer and meet the people you so clearly despise. You'll learn something about respect." Blake didn't answer. He just stood there, his face pale, unsure how to react. Nicholas didn't wait for him to respond. He turned and walked out of the showroom, his wife's car secured and Blake Thompson's arrogance firmly dismantled. The next month, at the Veterans Fundraiser Gala, Blake appeared in a simple black polo, a volunteer badge pinned to his chest. The sight of him pushing a wheelchair for a young veteran was a far cry from the arrogant salesman he had been. As he worked, he couldn't help but reflect on the lesson he had learned. His earlier beliefs had been challenged, and through his time volunteering, he had seen firsthand what real strength and resilience looked like. It wasn't about political affiliation, it was about humanity. Later, Karoline and Nicholas approached him, their expressions calm but satisfied. Blake met their gaze, his voice low as he apologized. "I was wrong," he said. "I judged you by your politics, but I see now that a person's worth isn't defined by that." Karoline smiled faintly, her eyes steady. "You've learned something. That's all that matters." The gala continued, laughter and music filling the air. Blake Thompson may have been a man who had once seen the world through a narrow, judgmental lens, but now, after being forced to confront his own biases, he had learned the true meaning of respect. As the gala continued, the atmosphere grew lively, filled with the chatter of veterans, families, and donors. Karoline and Nicholas moved through the crowd, their presence commanding attention. They had earned their place here, not just through wealth, but through hard work, determination, and a commitment to principles they believed in. Karoline felt a sense of satisfaction as she glanced over at Blake, who was still wheeling the young veteran, Tom, toward the buffet table. Nicholas leaned over to her, his voice soft. "He's trying," he said, his gaze flicking toward Blake. "Not a bad start." Karoline nodded, but her mind wandered back to the earlier encounter at the dealership. Despite everything, Blake had managed to do what so many others couldn't. He had admitted he was wrong. She had never expected that kind of humility from someone like him, but then again, she had never expected him to try and humiliate her in the first place. Her thoughts were interrupted as Blake approached them, his expression hesitant. He stopped a few feet away, his posture stiff. "Miss Leavitt," he began, his voice tinged with reluctance. "I want to apologize for everything. The way I treated you at the dealership was wrong." Karoline studied him for a moment. There was no smugness in his demeanor now, no sense of superiority. There was only genuine regret. Blake shifted uncomfortably, glancing over at Nicholas before speaking again. "I was caught up in my own biases, and I didn't take the time to really understand who you were or what you stood for. I let my politics cloud my judgment. I'm sorry for that." Nicholas gave a small nod, but Karoline remained silent for a moment. Her gaze softened. "You were wrong to judge me based on my beliefs," she said finally. "But what matters now is that you're trying to make it right. That's the most important thing." Blake's shoulders relaxed slightly at her words, and he offered a small, genuine smile. "I've been working with some of the veterans here, and I've learned a lot. It's not about politics, it's about respect. And I understand that now." Tom, the young veteran, spoke up from beside Blake, a grin spreading across his face. "Blake here's actually gotten pretty good at shooting hoops," he said, his voice light-hearted. "He's still clumsy, but we're getting there." Blake chuckled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I'm still working on it. But I'm learning." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "Shooting hoops, huh? Didn't take you for the athletic type, Blake." Blake grinned, but it was clear that there was no longer any arrogance behind it. "I wasn't either, but I've got a good coach now." The small moment of levity was a relief, and Karoline felt her tension ease. She hadn't come to the gala expecting to make a new ally out of Blake Thompson, but she couldn't deny that his efforts to change had made an impression. "All right," Karoline said, her tone lighter. "We'll let you off the hook for the hoops, just don't go bragging about it." Blake laughed, his voice a bit more at ease now. "I'll keep it under wraps, I promise." Nicholas, who had been watching the exchange with a quiet sense of satisfaction, finally spoke. "You've taken a step in the right direction, Blake. Keep it up, and maybe you'll surprise yourself. But don't forget, respect is earned through actions, not words." Blake nodded earnestly. "I won't forget." As Blake moved off to continue his duties, Karoline and Nicholas stood together, watching the scene unfold. The evening had turned out differently than they had expected. Blake's apology had been sincere, and while it didn't erase the hurt of the initial encounter, it had given them a sense of closure. Nicholas squeezed her hand gently. "I'm proud of you, he said quietly. You handled that with grace. Karoline smiled, the weight of the day finally lifting. I wasn't about to let him win. But I didn't want to make things worse, either. Sometimes, Nicholas replied, it's not about winning. It's about showing people the bigger picture. She nodded, her gaze lingering on Blake as he spoke with a group of veterans. The man had been humbled, and in that humility, Karoline saw something she hadn't expected: growth. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the evening wore on, Karoline and Nicholas joined the other guests, their laughter blending with the sounds of music and conversation. The gala was a success, the night filled with heartfelt moments, good food, and the spirit of community. Despite the tense start to the day, Karoline felt a sense of peace. The following morning, as the sun rose over Washington, D.C., Karoline sat at her desk in the office, her thoughts still lingering on the events of the past few days. She had always been someone who fought for what she believed in, even when it meant facing opposition. But today, there was something different in the air, something softer, something that spoke of understanding and change. Nicholas walked into the room, a cup of coffee in hand. He placed it on the desk and sat down across from her, his eyes meeting hers with a knowing smile. Another day, he said, his voice low and steady. Karoline nodded, her gaze shifting to the window where the early morning light filtered through the blinds. Yeah. Another day. But it feels different now, doesn't it? It does, he replied. There's been a shift. Not just with Blake, but in how we see things. You handled that situation better than I ever could. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. It wasn't easy, but sometimes the hardest things are the ones that make the most difference. Nicholas raised his cup in a silent toast. To making a difference. Karoline smiled, her eyes bright. To making a difference. And with that, they both knew the road ahead would continue to be difficult, but at least they weren't walking it alone. They had learned something valuable, that even in a world divided by politics, respect could still find its place. All it took was the willingness to listen, to learn, and to act with integrity. As Karoline sat back, a sense of fulfillment washed over her. She had won a battle, not through confrontation, but through perseverance. She had shown Blake Thompson that no one should ever be dismissed or belittled for their beliefs. And in the process, she had reminded herself, and those around her, that true strength came not from power or status, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to tear it all down. And as the day began in Washington, D.C., Karoline Leavitt knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. A month passed since the Veterans Gala, and life slowly returned to its usual pace. Karoline and Nicholas continued to balance their busy schedules with the knowledge that, despite the conflicts of the past, they had emerged victorious. Blake Thompson's apology had been meaningful, but it hadn't been just about the apology, it had been about change, about growing beyond the narrow views that once defined him. Karoline sat in her office, catching up on the usual paperwork, when she received an unexpected call. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end immediately gave her pause. Miss Leavitt, the voice said, crisp and formal. This is Richard Mason, the owner of Capital Luxury Motors. I just wanted to personally thank you for your patience during the situation with our dealership and Blake Thompson. We've made some changes here. I hope you'll consider us for your future purchases. Karoline leaned back in her chair, surprised but not entirely shocked. Thank you for reaching out, Mr. Mason. I appreciate the gesture. Richard's tone softened. It wasn't just a gesture, Miss Leavitt. I want you to know that we've made it a point to reevaluate how we treat all our customers, regardless of their political views. The incident with you and Blake was an eye-opener for all of us. Blake has been working hard to change his mindset, and I've personally seen an improvement. I hope that, going forward, we can rebuild your trust. Karoline paused, thinking carefully. It wasn't often that someone admitted to being wrong and worked toward fixing it. Maybe Blake's efforts had meant something after all. Maybe Richard, too, had learned something from the experience. "I'll take that into consideration," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It's good to know that you're making real changes." "Thank you," Richard said before ending the call. As Karoline hung up, she looked out the window of her office, reflecting on the past few weeks. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. It wasn't just about buying a car or winning a petty confrontation. It was about standing firm in what you believed, showing that respect should never be determined by political affiliation, and using your voice to make change, even when it seemed like the odds were against you. Karoline felt a quiet pride settle over her. She had faced criticism from the media and from those who disagreed with her beliefs. She had been the subject of countless attacks, but she had never backed down. And now, she had forced a change in someone who had initially dismissed her. She had proven to herself, and to those watching, that strength didn't always come from shouting the loudest or winning every argument. Sometimes, it came from standing firm in your values, holding your head high, and letting your actions speak louder than your words. Nicholas came into the office a few minutes later, carrying 2 coffee cups. He placed one on her desk and sat down across from her, his eyes filled with a quiet sense of contentment. "How was the call?" he asked. "It went well," Karoline replied. Richard Mason reached out. "It seems like they're genuinely trying to make things right. Blake's been working on changing his attitude. I think they're sincere about it." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "It's good to know they're learning from this. Not everyone would have reacted the way they did." "No," Karoline said, her voice soft but firm. "And it's not just about them learning. It's about us, too. We've learned something as well." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We've learned that people can change," Karoline replied. "That no matter how stubborn someone might be, there's always a chance for growth. It's not just about winning the argument, but about showing people that there's another way." Nicholas smiled, his pride in her evident. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice sincere. "You didn't just fight for what was right, you fought for understanding." Karoline smiled back, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Nicholas." He took a sip of his coffee and looked at her thoughtfully. "You didn't need me to win, Karoline. You've always been capable of doing that on your own. I just helped make sure you didn't have to face it alone." She reached out and took his hand, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The world might be filled with division, but in that moment, they knew that there was strength in unity, not just between them, but within themselves. The days passed, and Karoline's role at the White House continued to demand her attention. But now, as she drove the Azure coupe, the one she had fought so hard to claim, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just the car that had won her over. It was everything that had led to this moment. Every challenge, every obstacle, every moment of doubt. It had all brought her to a place of clarity. She was still the same person she had always been, the one who had stood in front of the press, the one who had fought for the truth, the one who had never let anyone define her. But now, there was a new layer to her. A layer that spoke of resilience, of grace under pressure, and of the quiet strength that came from knowing who she was and what she stood for. Nicholas joined her in the car as they drove toward their next engagement. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, Karoline felt at peace. The battles weren't over, and the challenges of politics would never cease. But in that moment, with her husband by her side and a car that symbolized more than just luxury, she knew that they could face whatever came their way. Blake Thompson had learned his lesson, but the true lesson wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who was watching, who had judged too quickly, who had refused to listen, who had failed to see beyond the surface. In a world filled with division and hatred, Karoline had reminded everyone of something simple, yet profound: respect isn't given because of your political views, it's earned through how you treat others. As the city rolled by, Karoline smiled to herself. She had fought for what was right, stood firm in her beliefs, and emerged victorious. And no matter what the future held, she knew she would never let anyone silence her.